June 22, 1941. The skies over Eastern Europe roared with the engines of hundreds of aircraft. Among them, a decorated German ace, flying his Messerschmitt on the very first day of the invasion of the Soviet Union. But by nightfall, he was gone. No wreckage, no radio, no body. Only fragments of a report, hidden for decades, whisper what may have happened in those final, chaotic minutes. This is not just the story of a pilot. It's the story of a mystery that outlived a war. To understand how an ace could vanish without a trace, we must start long before that fateful day. Wolfgang Schellmann was born on February 12, 1911, in the city of Kassel, Germany. Kassel sits in the heart of the country, a place of modest industry and quiet neighborhoods. It was the kind of town where boys grew up watching the world change around them, where the echoes of the First World War still hung in the air, and where a young man's future seemed uncertain at best. Germany in 1911 was a nation full of pride and power. But by the time Wolfgang was old enough to understand the world, that pride had been shattered. The Great War had ended in defeat. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped Germany of its military might, its colonies, its dignity. And for young men like Wolfgang, the future looked narrow and gray. But Wolfgang was not the kind to sit still. In 1930, at just 19 years old, he joined the Reichswehr, the small restricted army that Germany was allowed to maintain under the treaty. It wasn't much. The Reichswehr was a shadow of what the old imperial army had been, but it was a start. And for Wolfgang, it was a doorway. Now, here's where the story takes a turn that might surprise you. Because even though Germany wasn't supposed to have an air force, even though the treaty explicitly forbade it, the country was secretly training pilots anyway, and Wolfgang Schellmann was one of them. In the early 1930s, Germany struck a quiet deal with the Soviet Union. Yes, the Soviets, the very people they would one day go to war against. The arrangement was simple. Germany would send its young pilots to a secret training base in Lipetsk, deep inside Russia, where they could learn to fly military aircraft away from the watchful eyes of Britain and France. It was a strange twist of history, wasn't it? The future enemies, working together in the shadows. Wolfgang was among the fortunate few selected for this covert program. He traveled east into a foreign land and learned to fly in the wide, empty skies over the Russian steppe. He wasn't just learning a skill. He was becoming part of something new, a generation of aviators who would one day form the backbone of a reborn German Air Force. These men were quiet, disciplined, and hungry. They knew they were being prepared for something bigger. They just didn't know what yet. By the mid-1930s, Germany had cast off the shackles of Versailles. Adolf Hitler had come to power, and with him came a new military machine. The Luftwaffe was born, Germany's air force, built from the ground up with men like Wolfgang at its core. He was no longer a secret trainee, he was an officer, a fighter pilot, and soon he would be tested in the crucible of real combat. In 1936, civil war erupted in Spain. On one side stood the Republican government, supported by the Soviet Union and international volunteers. On the other stood the nationalists, led by General Francisco Franco, and backed by Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. For Hitler, Spain was an opportunity, a chance to test new tactics, new aircraft, and new pilots. And so the Condor Legion was formed, a volunteer force of German airmen sent to fight in someone else's war. Wolfgang Schellmann was among them. Picture this, a young pilot, not yet 30, flying over the mountains and valleys of Spain. The landscape below is torn by war. Villages burn. Columns of soldiers march through the dust. And above it all, the sky becomes a proving ground. Wolfgang flew a Messerschmitt Bf-109, one of the most advanced fighters of its time. Sleek, fast, deadly. and he learned quickly. On January 7, 1938, near the city of Teruel, Wolfgang Schellmann scored his first aerial victory. He shot down an enemy aircraft, likely a Soviet-made fighter flown by a Republican pilot. It was a moment that changed everything. Because once you've tasted that kind of success, once you've outmaneuvered another man in the sky and lived to tell about it, you're never quite the same. Wolfgang didn't stop at one. Over the months that followed, he racked up victory after victory. By the time the Spanish Civil War ended in 1939, he had 12 confirmed kills, 12 enemy aircraft destroyed. He wasn't just a pilot anymore, he was an ace, a squadron leader, a man other pilots looked up to, and the Luftwaffe took notice. But this quiet beginning would soon collide with the world's gathering storm. On September 1, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The Second World War had begun, and Wolfgang Schellmann, now a seasoned combat veteran, was right in the middle of it. He was assigned to Jagdgeschwader 77, Fighter Wing 77, one of the Luftwaffe's frontline units. The campaign in Poland was swift and brutal. The Polish Air Force, brave as it was, stood no chance against the modern tactics and superior aircraft of the Germans. Within weeks, Poland was defeated. But for Wolfgang, this was only the beginning. He was building a reputation, not just as a skilled pilot, but as a leader. He understood tactics. He understood how to motivate men. And he understood the deadly arithmetic of air combat, how to position yourself, when to strike, when to pull back. These were lessons learned in Spain, refined in Poland, and about to be tested on an even larger stage. In early 1940, Wolfgang married Anneliese Gedicke. It was a brief moment of normalcy in a world spiraling into chaos. We don't know much about their time together. History doesn't always preserve the quiet moments. But we know this: Wolfgang Schellmann was not just a warrior, he was a husband. A man with a life beyond the cockpit. And that makes what comes next all the more poignant. By the time the world plunged into total war, Schellmann was already a legend in the making. In May 1940, Germany launched its assault on France and the Low Countries. The strategy was bold, almost reckless, a massive armored thrust through the Ardennes forest, a place the Allies thought was impassable. Above the tanks and the chaos, the Luftwaffe ruled the skies, and Wolfgang was there, flying mission after mission. He was reassigned to Jagdgeschwader 2, Fighter Wing 2, and thrown into the heart of the action. The skies over Belgium and northern France became a deadly chessboard. British and French pilots fought bravely, but they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered. Wolfgang's tally grew. He shot down RAF Hurricanes, tough, reliable fighters flown by determined men. He downed Lysanders, slow, vulnerable reconnaissance planes that had no business being in a dogfight. Every victory added to his score, to his reputation, to the legend. But don't mistake this for glory without cost. Air combat is intimate and brutal. You see the other pilot. Sometimes you see the fear in their maneuvers, and when you pull the trigger and watch them spiral down, trailing smoke and fire, you carry that with you. Wolfgang never spoke publicly about what that felt like. Most aces didn't, but you can be sure it left its mark. France fell in June 1940. It was one of the most stunning military victories in history, and for the Luftwaffe, it seemed like nothing could stop them. Wolfgang Schellmann was now one of Germany's top fighter pilots. His name was known. His face appeared in propaganda photos. He was the kind of man the regime wanted to hold up as a symbol of the new Germany, strong, skilled, unbeatable. And then came the battle that would define the Luftwaffe's rise and its limits. The Battle of Britain began in the summer of 1940. Hitler wanted to invade England, but first he needed control of the skies. And so the Luftwaffe launched a massive campaign to destroy the Royal Air Force. Day after day, German bombers and fighters crossed the English Channel, and day after day, they were met by Spitfires and Hurricanes flown by men who refused to give up. Wolfgang Schellmann was right in the thick of it. He led fighter sweeps, formations of Messerschmitts roaring over the southern coast of England, looking for targets, looking for a fight. He shot down Spitfires. He tangled with bombers. He watched friends go down in flames. The Battle of Britain was unlike anything he'd experienced before. The enemy was dug in, determined, and fighting for their homeland. And slowly, the tide began to turn. But even as the battle raged, Wolfgang's star continued to rise. In August 1940, he was promoted to the rank of major and given command of Jagdgeschwader II, an entire fighter wing. He was just 29 years old. Think about that for a moment. At an age when many men are still figuring out their careers, Wolfgang Schellmann was leading hundreds of pilots in one of the most important battles of the war. And on September 5, 1940, his achievements were recognized at the highest level. He was awarded the Knight's Cross of the Iron Cross, one of Germany's most prestigious military honors. It was pinned to his collar in a formal ceremony. His name was in the newspapers. He was a national hero, but even heroes can be moved like chess pieces in a larger game. By the end of 1940, the Battle of Britain had been lost. The Luftwaffe had failed to break the RAF, and Hitler's invasion plans were shelved. But the war wasn't over. Far from it. Germany's attention was shifting. New plans were being drawn up. New fronts were opening. And Wolfgang Schellmann, like so many others, was about to be sent somewhere far more dangerous than the skies over England. In early 1941, Wolfgang was transferred once again, this time to Jagdgeschwader 27, Fighter Wing 27. The unit was being prepared for a new kind of war. They trained in southern Germany. They practiced low-level attacks, ground support missions, and long-range patrols. Something big was coming. Everyone could feel it. Wolfgang was at the height of his power and status. He had flown in 3 major campaigns. He had over 20 confirmed victories. He was a wing commander, a Knight's Cross recipient, a man trusted by his superiors and respected by his men. He had a wife waiting for him at home. He had every reason to believe he'd survive this war and go on to live a long life. But he was unknowingly nearing his final mission. The Eastern Front was unlike anything before. It was vast, brutal, and unpredictable. On June 22, 1941, at 3:15 in the morning, Germany launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest military operation in history. Over 3 million men, thousands of tanks, and hundreds of aircraft poured across the border. The goal was simple: crush the Soviet Union in a matter of weeks. Wolfgang Schellmann and his unit were part of the opening wave. They took off from airfields in occupied Poland and flew east into the rising sun. Their mission: to achieve air superiority, to destroy Soviet aircraft on the ground and in the air, to clear the way for the advancing army. And at first, it worked. The Soviet Air Force was caught completely off guard. Hundreds of planes were destroyed before they even left the ground. German fighters roamed the skies almost unopposed. It felt, for a few hours, like another easy victory. Wolfgang flew sortie after sortie that day. The adrenaline must have been overwhelming, the fear, the focus. And then, in the chaos of that first morning, he scored what would be his final confirmed aerial victory. He shot down a Soviet I-16, a stubby little fighter, outdated but flown by brave men. It was his 25th kill, though some records suggest he may have had more. Moments later, everything changed. According to witness accounts, and these are murky, you understand, pulled together from scattered reports and half-remembered conversations, Wolfgang's Messerschmitt collided with the very aircraft he'd just shot down, or perhaps with another Soviet fighter in the chaos. The details blur. What we know is this: his plane was damaged, badly, and somewhere over the contested skies near the town of Grodno, in what is now Belarus, Wolfgang Schellmann bailed out. A parachute was seen, white silk against the summer sky, drifting down toward a landscape that was, in that moment, neither fully German nor fully Soviet, just a no-man's land of confusion, gunfire, and terror. And then, silence. No radio transmission came through. No rescue party found him. No one from his unit saw him again. By evening, when the squadrons returned to base and the pilots gathered to debrief, Wolfgang Schellmann was simply gone. His wingmen didn't know what had happened. His ground crew waited for news that never came. And back in Germany, Anneliese, his wife of barely a year, would soon receive the most dreaded message a military spouse can get: missing in action. But the mystery does not end in the sky. It deepens on the ground. Grodno was a contested city in those early days of the invasion. Soviet forces were retreating in disarray, but they hadn't collapsed entirely. German units were pushing forward rapidly, but the front lines were fluid, chaotic. In some places, you could walk a few hundred meters and cross from German control into Soviet-held territory without even realizing it. Stragglers, partisans, confused soldiers from both sides, all mixed together in a deadly confusion. If Wolfgang survived the parachute landing, and that's a significant if, he would have touched down in the middle of that chaos. He would have been wearing a Luftwaffe uniform, carrying a sidearm, possibly injured from the bailout. And he would have been utterly alone. The official German records listed him as missing. For months, that's all anyone knew. His unit moved on. The war ground forward. And Wolfgang Schellmann became one more name on a growing list of men who had vanished into the fog of war. But unlike most, his story didn't end there. Rumors began to circulate almost immediately. Some said he'd been shot while descending in his parachute, a grim reality that happened more often than anyone wanted to admit on both sides. Others whispered that he'd been captured by Soviet forces and taken prisoner. Still, others suggested he'd been killed on the ground by NKVD troops, Stalin's secret police, who operated behind the front lines and were known for their ruthlessness. But for decades, these were just theories, whispers passed between veterans at reunions, footnotes in Luftwaffe histories, a sad, unresolved mystery that most people forgot about as the war dragged on and the body count climbed into the millions. Until something changed. For decades, this would remain an open wound in military archives. You see, the Soviet Union was a closed society. After the war ended, the Iron Curtain descended, and whatever records the Soviets had compiled about captured or killed German soldiers were locked away in Moscow. Western historians couldn't access them. German researchers couldn't verify anything. Families of the missing were left with nothing but uncertainty and grief. And so, Wolfgang Schellmann's fate remained unknown. But then, in the 1990s, the Soviet Union collapsed. Archives began to open, slowly, unevenly, but they opened. Researchers started digging through dusty files that hadn't been touched in 50 years. And among those files, buried in reports from the NKVD and Soviet military intelligence, were fragments that seemed to reference Wolfgang Schellmann. A lost Soviet report surfaces decades later. The document, and I want to be clear here because this is where the story gets murky and we have to be careful, described the capture of a high-ranking Luftwaffe officer, on or around June 22, 1941, near Grodno. The description matched a major, a fighter pilot, wearing decorations including what sounds like the Knight's Cross. The report indicated he was interrogated briefly and then, well, that's where things get dark. According to this account, the officer was executed shortly after capture, not in combat, not in a firefight, but executed by NKVD personnel as a perceived threat or as part of the brutal policies that Stalin's forces followed in those early, panicked days of the invasion. The Soviets were retreating, terrified, and often operating under orders to leave nothing useful behind for the Germans, including prisoners who might provide intelligence. Now, we have to be cautious. This report has never been fully verified. Some historians believe it refers to Wolfgang Schellmann. Others think it might describe a different German officer captured that same day. The Eastern Front was enormous. Dozens of pilots and officers went missing in the opening weeks. The details are frustratingly vague. But the timing, the location, the rank, they all align. And if it's true, it means Wolfgang Schellmann didn't die in a blaze of glory. He didn't go down fighting in the sky. He landed, perhaps injured, perhaps frightened, and was taken prisoner. And then, in a field or a basement somewhere near Grodno, his life ended at the hands of men who saw him not as a fellow human being, but as an enemy to be eliminated. Conflicting narratives, heroic death in combat versus execution behind enemy lines. Which version is true? We may never know for certain. And maybe, in a way, that's what makes this story so haunting. Because Wolfgang Schellmann exists in that terrible space between history and mystery. He's not a hero whose death was witnessed and honored, but he's not forgotten either. He's suspended in uncertainty, a man whose final moments are known only to those who didn't survive to tell the story. Time turned facts into whispers, but whispers have a way of reaching us. Over the decades, Wolfgang's story became a symbol of something larger. Not just one man's fate, but the fate of thousands of men on all sides who vanished without a trace. The Eastern Front devoured people. It was vast, brutal, and chaotic in ways that the Western Front never was. Men died in forests and swamps where no one would find them. They were buried in unmarked graves or not buried at all. Records were lost, destroyed, or never made in the first place. And for the families left behind, that uncertainty was its own kind of torture. Anneliese Schellmann would have spent years not knowing, wondering, hoping against hope that maybe, somehow, Wolfgang was alive in a prisoner camp somewhere. That one day the war would end and he'd come home. But that day never came. How did Wolfgang Schellmann's disappearance echo through Luftwaffe command? Well, in practical terms, it didn't stop the war machine. Another officer was promoted to take his place. The unit flew on, but among the men who knew him, the pilots who'd flown beside him in Spain, in France, over Britain, his loss was deeply felt. He was one of the originals, one of the aces who'd been there from the beginning, and his disappearance on the very first day of the new campaign felt like a bad omen. In the years since, historians have pointed to Wolfgang Schellmann's story as emblematic of the chaos and brutality of the Eastern Front. This wasn't war as the propaganda films portrayed it. Clean, heroic, with clear winners and losers. This was war as it actually was. Messy, tragic, and full of unanswered questions. Wolfgang became a symbol, intentionally or not, of the vanished ace, the man who flew too close to the edge and fell off the map. And in a strange way, his story has outlived those of pilots who survived the war and lived to old age because we remember the mysteries. We remember the ones who didn't come home. His story also became a lens through which we can examine what the early Eastern Front was really like, the chaos, the disorganization, the way even elite units could lose men without understanding how or why. Wolfgang Schellmann was not a low-ranking soldier. He was a wing commander, a decorated ace, a man whose survival should have been a priority, and yet the war swallowed him whole. For veterans who lived through similar experiences, and I know some of you watching this may have served in wars where friends vanished and were never found, Wolfgang's story resonates. It's a reminder that war doesn't discriminate. It doesn't matter how skilled you are, how decorated, how loved. In the chaos of battle, anyone can become a name on a missing in action report. And for the families, the cultural weight of these unresolved wartime mysteries is staggering. Think about what it means to never have closure, to never be able to visit a grave, to never know for certain what happened in those final moments. It's a wound that doesn't heal, and it's a wound that gets passed down through generations. Wolfgang's family, if any descendants are still alive today, carry that uncertainty with them. They know he was a skilled pilot, a decorated officer, but they don't know how his story ended. Not really. Perhaps the greatest legacy of men like him is what they leave behind in silence, because Wolfgang Schellmann's story isn't just about one pilot. It's about all the men and women who served and disappeared, the ones whose names are carved on memorials to the missing, the ones whose families still wonder, even 80 years later, what really happened. And here's the thing we need to understand. History isn't just the stories we know. It's also the stories we don't. The gaps, the silences, the missing pages. Wolfgang Schellmann flew over 300 combat missions. He scored at least 25 aerial victories, possibly more. He trained in secret in the Soviet Union, fought in Spain, led men through 3 major campaigns, and earned one of his nation's highest honors. By any measure, he lived a remarkable life, but his legacy isn't just in the victories, it's in the mystery, it's in the questions that still linger, and it's in the reminder that war takes more than lives. It takes stories, it takes certainty, it takes closure. We live in an age now where technology can track almost anything, where satellites watch from above and every movement is recorded. But in 1941, you could be one of the most famous pilots in the Luftwaffe and still vanish without a trace. That's sobering, and it's something worth remembering. So, what do we take away from Wolfgang Schellmann's story? What does it mean for us, here, now, more than 80 years later? I think it means this. We honor the ones who served not just by celebrating their victories, but by acknowledging their sacrifices. And sometimes, the greatest sacrifice isn't dying in battle, it's disappearing into history and being forgotten. Wolfgang hasn't been forgotten, not entirely, but his story has been obscured by time, by lost records, by the sheer scale of the war, and it's up to us to pull these stories back into the light. Because when we remember men like Wolfgang Schellmann, we're not glorifying war. We're not celebrating violence or conquest. We're simply acknowledging that these were real people. They had families. They had hopes and fears. They flew into the sky not knowing if they'd come back. And when they didn't, they left behind emptiness that nothing can fill. Some heroes return home to medals and parades. Others disappear into the fog of war, leaving behind only echoes. Schellmann's story is a reminder that history isn't just written in books, it's hidden in the missing pages. We can't bring Wolfgang back. We can't give his family the closure they deserved, but we can do this. We can tell his story. We can make sure that his name isn't just a footnote, but a reminder of the cost of war. And we can honor all those who vanished, on all sides, in all wars, by refusing to let them be forgotten. If stories like this matter to you, if you believe forgotten history deserves to be remembered, then join us. Subscribe, leave a comment below with your thoughts, or share a story of your own. Maybe you served. Maybe you lost someone who never came home. Maybe you just believe that these stories are worth preserving. Whatever your reason, you're part of keeping this history alive. Because the past isn't past until it's forgotten. And as long as we're here telling these stories, asking these questions, honoring these lives, Wolfgang Schellmann and the thousands like him will never truly be gone. Thank you for listening, and thank you for remembering.